Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining me this evening. This is my fourth time in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I've really enjoyed doing this. Partially, it's one of my favorite Halloween stories because the history geek side of me really ghost story, and that it takes place here in New York, and you can actually go and trace the famous Sleepy Hollow. It's something that I've found very fascinating. So I just wanted to learn this story, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed telling it. So without further ado, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of at that broad expanse denominated by the ancient Dutch settlers the Tavern, they always shortened their sail and implored the protections of St. Nicholas as they nevertheless the small market town rural name of Tarrytown. This name is given in former days, we are told, by the good housewives of the vicinity for the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely avert to it for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this town, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a small village, or rather a lack of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is perhaps the only sound that ever breaks in among the uniform tranquility. From the listless repose of this place and the peculiar nature of its inhabitants, who are descendant of the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are known as the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. They are quite strange fellows, you know. The neighborhood abounds with haunted tales, twilight spots, and local superstitions. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor in the early days of the settlement, long before the land was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson, while others believe that the place was held by a former native chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, and would hold his powwows there long before the land was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson again. You know, stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the night sky here than any other parts of the country. And the whole nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. The dominant spirit, which appears to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a figure on horseback, without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head was carried away by a cannonball in the early days of the Revolution. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent country roads, and especially, at no great distance, to the vicinity of a whitewashed church. Local beliefs allege that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, that the ghost rides forth in nightly quest to the scene of battle in search of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he travels along the hollow like a midnight blast is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition that has furnished many a wild tale in that region of shadow. And the nightmare is known by all country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is in such little retired Dutch communities embosomed here and there in the great state of New York that populations, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrents of migration and changes and improvement, it sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw and bubble ride quietly at anchor, undisturbed by the rushing current. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, I wonder whether I should not find the same trees and families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. In a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, there was a worthy wight by the name of Ichabod Crane who sojourned, or as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the forest as well as for the mind, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen and schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was, well, it was not inapplicable to his appearance. He was tall and exceedingly lank, with long arms and legs, feet they might have served for shovels, and his hands dangled a mile out of his sleeves. He had narrow shoulders, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears and large green glassy eyes, with a long sniped nose that, perched upon his spindle neck, made him appear as though he were a weathercock to say which way the wind would blow. To see his profile on a windy day striding and gallivanting along with all his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, you would have thought that some scarecrow had eloped from his cornfield, or the genius of famine descended upon the valley. His schoolhouse was a low building, rudely constructed of logs, of one large room. The windows were partly glazed and partly patched by leaves of old copybooks, and it was secured at vacant hours most ingeniously by a withe twisted in the handle of the door, with stakes set against the window shutters, so that, well, though a thief might get in with perfect ease, he would have some embarrassment in getting out. An idea most probably borrowed by the architect Joost van Houten from The Mystery of an Eel Pot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation at the foot of a woody hill, with a formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices could be heard conning over their lessons on a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master in a tone of menace, or peradventure by the appalling sound of the birch as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and bore in mind that golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars were certainly not spoiled. I would not have it imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel potentates of the school who took joy in the suffering and subject of his subjects. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, and take the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. Why, your mere puny stripling that would wince beneath the flightest flourish of the rod was passed by, but a double portion was found on the hide of the short-skirted, tough, broad-sided Dutch urchin who would sulk and swell and grew dogged and sullen beneath the birch. All this he called doing his duty by their parents, and he never inflicted a chastisement so consolatory to the smarting urchin that they would remember it and thank him for it the longest day they had to live. When school hours were over, he was often the companion and playmate of some of the larger children, and on holiday afternoons would accompany some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters, or good housewives for mothers noted for the comforts of their cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils, for the revenue arising from his schoolhouse was small, and scarcely enough to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder. And though lank, he had the dilating powers of an anaconda. So, to help out his maintenance, he was, according to country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged with the families whose children he instructed. With this, he lived successfully a week at a time with all of his belongings tied up in a little cotton handkerchief. Among his other vocation, he was also the singing master of the vicinity, and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folk in psalmody. It was of no small bit of vanity and pride to him to take his station at the center of the church gallery on a Sunday with a band of chosen singers around him, where there in his own mind he completely carried the palm away from the parson. Certain it is, his voice resounded far above the rest, and there are peculiar quavers still to be heard in that church, quite half-mile off, even to the opposite side of the mill pond, that are said to be directly descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, by divers little makeshifts, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought by all who understood nothing of the labor of head work to have a wonderfully easy life of it. From his half-itinerant life, too, he was a kind of traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip with him, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and he was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's A History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, when school was dismissed, it was often his pleasure to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover that bordered his schoolhouse, in thought over old Mather's direful tale. It became a mere mist before his eyes. As he wended his way out swamp and in its winging flight, well, the poor varlet was ready to give up the ghost with the thought that he had been struck by a witch's token. His only resource on such occasion to drown thought or drive away the spirit was to sing psalm tunes to himself. And the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by their doors of an evening, were often filled with awe at hearing his nasal melody. Sweetness, long drawn out. Another of his fearful pleasures was to spend winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat by the fire spinning and listened to their tales of ghosts and goblins. And particularly of the headless horseman, or galloping Hessian of the hollow, as they sometimes referred to him. But if there was a pleasure in all of this, while snugly cuddled in a warm chimney corner that was all of a ruddy glow, and where, of course, no specter would dare show its face, it was dearly purchased by his subsequent walk homewards. With what wistful eye did he see every shrub sheeted with snow, that it appeared as a specter before his path. How often did he cringe at the sound of his own footsteps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder, lest it should be some uncouth being tramping close behind him. And how often was he thrown into complete horror by the sound of a rushing blast through the dry breeze, with the thought that it was the galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings. Yet, daylight brought an end to all these troubles. And though he had been beset by Satan in diverse shapes in his lonely perambulations, he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in spite of the devil in all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the entire race of witches together. And that was a woman. Among his musical disciples to gather one evening for his instruction in song was Katrina Van Axel, the daughter and only heiress of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass, fresh as a partridge, bright, melting, and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's prized peaches. She was famed not merely for her beauty, but also for her vast expectations, and was withal a little of a coquette, as might have been perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions that were best suited to set off her charms. Wore the ornaments of pure yellow gold, which were passed down through her family from the old country, and withal a provokingly short petticoat, so as to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the whole country round. Ichabod had a soft and foolish heart toward her paternal manner. Old Baltic's Van Castle was a perfect picture of a thriving, liberal-hearted, contented old soul. He seldom, it is true, said either his thoughts or his sight. farm, but within those, everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, though not proud of it, and piqued himself on the hearty abundance rather than the style which he lived. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon Van Tassel's sumptuous array of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in its belly and an apple in its mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed with a coverlet of crust. The ducks were paired cozily in a little pan like snug married couples. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and in the porkers he saw the future sleek sides of bacon and juicy relishing ham. And not a turkey he beheld, but daintily trussed up with a gizzard under its wing and peradventure a necklace of savory sausages. And beyond those he saw the rich buckwheat fields and fields of yellow corn with their yellow ears peeking out towards the sun, and beneath those were the great pumpkins with their fair round bright bellies turned towards the sun. Surrounding them was orchards burdened with ruddy fruit that all surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel. From the moment Ichabod eyed these regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this endeavor, however, he had more to contend with than generally fell to the lot of a knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything other than giants, enchanters, and fire-breathing dragons and other easily conquered foes to contend with, and had to merely make his way over walls of adamant, through gates of brass, into the castle keep where the lady of his heart was confined. And then she gave him her hand as a matter of course. Ichabod, however, had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette, beset with her numerous whims and caprices, and had to win her over in spite of the adversaries of real flesh and blood, the numerous rustic admirers that beset every pathway to her heart, keeping a watchful, angry eye upon each other, but were always ready to fly out in common cause should any newcomer arise. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade by the name of Abraham, or, according to the Dutch abbreviation, Bram van Brunt, the hero of the country round, renowned for his great feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short black curly hair and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance. For his great Herculean powers and men, he was known as Bram Bones by all the country round. As dexterous on horseback as a Tartar, and was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but he had more mischief than ill will in his composition. And with the ascendancy that always comes with strength in a rustic life, he was the umpire in all local disputes, setting his hat on one side and making a decision that showed of no favoritism or gainsay with the other. The local people revered him with a mixture of awe and respect, and when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, well, the people simply shook their heads and warranted, Bram Bones was at the bottom of it. This rantipole hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries, and though his gentle caresses and endearments were not unlike those of a bear, it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Indeed, his advances were signals for other rivals to retire, having no inclination to cross a lion in his amours, any more than that stormy lover Achilles. Ichabod, however, was a mixture of pliability and perseverance. He was yielding, but tough, like a supple jack. Though he bent beneath the slightest pressure, yet the moment it was away, jerk! He carried his head and himself as erect and his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under the cover of his character as singing master, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend in the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of young lovers. Old Baltus Van Tassel loved his daughter, even better than his pipe, and like a good man and an excellent father, he let her have her way in everything. Thus, while honest Balt sat at one end of his piazza, smoking his evening pipe, Ichabod sauntered along in the twilights with the daughter, that hour so favorable to the lover's eloquence. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me, they have always been matters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have 1,000 doors of access, while others seem to have only but a single point of entry. It is a great triumph of skill to win 1,000 common hearts, for man must battle for his fortress at every door and window. Indeed, the man who wins 1,000 common hearts is indeed a hero, but the man who holds undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. This was evidently not the case with the redoubtable Brom Bones, for the moment Ichabod made his advances known, the interests of the rival evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the palings of Van Tassel's on a Sunday night, and a deadly feud gradually arose between he and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who feigned matters to open warfare and settled their pretensions to the lady, thus by single combat. Ichabod, however, was too wary of the superior might of his adversary, and was too conscious to enter the lists against him. He left Brom no alternative but to draw on his funds of rustic waggery at his disposition and play off boorish practical jokes upon the schoolmaster. He harried his otherwise peaceful domains. He smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney and broke into the schoolhouse after hours despite its formidable fastenings of withe and window stakes, and turned everything topsy-turvy, so that the poor varlet began to think that all the witches of the country held their meetings there. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all manner of opportunity to ridicule Ichabod in the presence of their mistress, and had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous fashion and introduced him as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. In this way, matters continued for some time without producing any material effect on the relative situation at hand. On a fine autumnal day, Ichabod sat enthroned upon the lofty stool from whence he usually looked over his little literary realm, when suddenly the quiet study of his pupils was interrupted by the appearance of a messenger with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a quilting frolic or merrymaking that evening at the castle of Mynheer Van Tassel. Well, all was bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. The students were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles. Those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity, while those who were tardy had a smart application in the rear to help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put back on the shelves. Inkstands were overturned, benches thrown down, and the whole school was turned loose an hour before its usual time. Ichabod now spent at least an extra half hour in his toilet, brushing up his best, and indeed only suit rusty black, and arranged his locks by a broken piece of looking glass that hung up in his schoolhouse. That he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier, he borrowed a horse from the Dutch farmer with whom he was domiciliated, the choleric old Hans van Ripper, and thus gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight errant in quest of adventure. It is meet that I should, in the true style of romantic story, give some description to the appearance of my hero and his steed. The creature he bestrode was a broken-down old plow horse that had outlived everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with a ewe-neck and head like a hammer. Its mane and tail were knotted and covered in burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, while the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, we must assume he had fire and metal in his day, if we can assume by the name he bore of gunpowder. Ichabod was a suitable rider for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of his saddle, and his elbows stuck out like those as a grasshopper, so that as he jogged along, the flapping of his arms was not unlike that of a pair of wings, and he carried the whip perpendicular in his hand. The tails of his coat fluttered out almost to the end of the horse's, and he wore a small wool cap which rested on the bridge of his nose, or so the scanty strip of forehead might be called. Thus was the appearance of my hero and his steed as he issued forth from the gate of Hans van Ripper. As I have mentioned, it was that jolly time of autumn, and as Ichabod jogged slowly along the banks of the Hudson, he was surrounded by the culinary symptoms of that happy, happy time of year. All around him, he took in the sights of the vast stores of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence in the trees, while others were piled high on the ground, destined for the cider press, and others were heaped up in baskets destined for the markets. And beyond those were the rich fields of buckwheat and corn, and beneath them were the great yellow pumpkins, all hinting at the promise of delicate puddings, hasty slapjacks, and cakes and other such treats prepared by the delicate, dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. It was towards evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Hans von Ripper, where he found the adjacent country's pride and flower, the old Dutch farmers, a spare leathern-faced race in homespun clothes and handmade ornaments. The daughters were almost as antiquated as their fine frock or ribbon or straw hat gave symptom to city innovation. The sons were in their shirts, skirted coat, their stupendous brass buttons and pewter buckles. They're styled up, queued up in the style of the time, especially if they could procure an eelskin, it being noted as a strengthener and nourisher of the hair. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the occasion on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mettle and mischief. Indeed, he was known for preferring a wild, unbroken steed, for he beheld attractive, well-behaved animals as unworthy of a lad of spirit. Fain would I pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel. Not that of the bevy of buxom lasses with their ample displays of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch tea table in that happy time of autumn. Such heaped up dainties known to only the most experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughty donut, the tender oorliekoek, the crisp and crumbling cruller, and then there were sweet cakes and ginger cakes and honey cakes and apple cakes and a whole family of cakes, and then there were apple pies, peach pies, plum pies, bowls of pickled fruits, of broiled shad, roast chicken, sliced ham, smoked beef, beside bowls and milk and cream mingled together, all higgledy-piggledy, pretty much as I have enumerated them. Heaven bless the mark! I want breath and time to describe this bounty as it deserves. Alas, I am too eager to get on with my story. Ichabod, however, was in no such hurry, but he did ample service to sample each and every dainty that lay before him. Why, he was a kind and thankful creature whose spirits rose as eating as is some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his eyes to himself as he ate, and chuckling to himself how he might one day be lord of all this almost undescribable luxury and splendor. Then he thought to himself how soon he'd turn his back on the old schoolhouse and snap his fingers in the face of Hans von Ripper or any other itinerant pedagogue that should dare to call him comrade. Then the sound of music summoned to the common room, or hall. The musician was an old gray-haired man who had been the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His instrument was as old and battered as himself, and the greater part of the time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, bowing almost to the floor, only to stump his foot when a couple was to start. Ichabod Crane prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle, and to have seen him striding about the room before you in person, you would have thought that St. Vitus, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. How then could the flogger of urchins be anything other than amorous and joyous, the lady of his heart, was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously at all his amorous oglings, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in a corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted by a knot of some of the sager folk, who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking their pipes on the piazza and there conning over the tales of former times. But eventually, this subject turned to that favorite subject of Sleepy Hollow, that of the ghosts and goblins which were known to haunt the vicinity. The tale was told of the woman in white said to haunt Raven Rock, who can be heard crying out on snowy nights, having perished there in a blizzard herself. Tales were also told of the unfortunate Major Andre, who had been captured hard by. But eventually, the subjects all turned to that favorite specter of the region, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late and was known to tie his horse among the gravestones in the churchyard. The tale was told of old Brower, a most heretical disbeliever of ghosts and goblins, how he met the midnight trooper on returning from a recent foray into Sleepy Hollow, how they galloped together over bush, brake, swamp, and stream, until they reached the church bridge, when the Hessian turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower into a brook, and disappeared over the treetops in a flash of fire and brimstone. This tale was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous tale by that of Brom Bones, who alleges that he was overtaken by the midnight companion and challenged him to a bowl of punch, and should have won it soundly, too, for Daredevil beat that goblin horse all hollow. But just as they reached the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and disappeared in a flash of lightning and thunder. All these tales that men gradually speak in the dark, the countenances only now and then occasionally receiving a gleam of a pipe, gradually sank deep into the mind of Ichabod Crane. The revel gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families and could be heard for some time clattering over the distant hills of Sleepy Hollow. Ichabod alone lingered behind, hoping, according to the country custom of country lovers who have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, and believing that he was on the high road to success. At this interview, I cannot say, for in fact I do not know, but something, I fear me, must have gone wrong, for he sallied forth after no great interval, with the air of a man quite desolate and chapfallen. These women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Were her advances of the pedagogue all a sham to secure the conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows. Not I. Suffice to say, he stole forth with the energy of one who has sacked a hen roost, rather than a fair lady's heart, and with several hearty ups and kicks roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters where he'd been sleeping. It was the very witching time of night. Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, began his pursuit homewards over the rolling hills which rise above Tarrytown, in which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. In the dead hush of midnight, he could hear the watchdog barking from the opposite shore of the Hudson, but it was so vague and faint that it only gave an idea of the distance between he and the faithful companion of man. No signs of life occurred around him, except for the occasional melancholy chirp of a cricket or guttural twang of a bullfrog, as if turning suddenly uncomfortably in his sleep. The hour grew darker and darker. The stars sank deeper into the night sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt more lonely and dismal in all his days. It was at this moment that all the stories he'd heard in the afternoon, that of the ghosts and goblins, now came crowding upon his recollection. He was, moreover, approaching the scene where many of the stories had been laid. At the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree that towered like a giant among the rest. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, wide enough that they could have served for trunks of regular trees. They twisted down almost to the earth, only to rise back up into the air. It was tied with the tragic tale of the unfortunate Major Andre, and has ever since been known as Major Andre's tree. The local people revered it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of the sake of respect for its ill-starred namesake, and partly due to the woeful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached the fearful tree, he began to whistle, but he thought his whistling was answered. But perceived it must be but a blast blowing through the dry branches. But as he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. But as he approached a little nearer, realized it was but where some lightning had struck the tree and left the white wood laid bare. But then he heard a moan. His teeth chattered, his knees smote against the very sides of the saddle, for it was but one bough rubbing against another in the breeze. Ichabod now passed the fearful tree in safety, but new perils now lay before him. About 200 yards past the tree, a small brook crossed the road with a few rough logs thrown side by side over it to serve as a kind of bridge. To cross this bridge was now his severest trial, for it was at this identical location that the unfortunate Andre was captured, and fearful is the schoolboy that must cross it alone after dark. His heart began to thump, but summoning up all his courage, he gave his horse half a score of kicks and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. The perverse old animal began, it is true, but it was only to make a lateral move where he ran broadside into a fence. The troubled pedagogue, whose fears rose with the delay, jerked the reins in the opposite direction, and the horse once again began, but it was now only to plunge to the opposite side of the road, where he ran into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The troubled pedagogue now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starling ribs of Gunpowder, who dashed forward with a suddenness only to come to an equal stop just at the foot of the bridge with an energy that had nearly sent his rider sprawling. Just at that moment, a plashy tramp caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. From the dark shadow of the grove, just at the foot of the bridge, emerged a figure. It was towering, misshapen, and massive. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom of the darkness. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue stood on end. What was to be done? To turn and fly now surely was too late, and what chance was there, especially if it were ghost or goblin which could ride on the very wings of the wind? In stammering accents, he demanded, "Who are you?" He received no reply. Repeated his demands in still more agitated tones. "Sir, I demand to know, who are you?" Still, he received no reply. Once more, he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible Gunpowder, who had gotten over his waywardness, and broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. At that very moment, the shadowy figure of Alarm put itself into motion and stood at once at the center of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, the form of the figure might now be ascertained. It appeared to be a horseman of towering proportions, shrouded in darkness, astride a steed of a powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof, jogging on the blind side of old Gunpowder as they walked. Ichabod, who had no relish for this midnight companion, quickened his steed in hopes of leaving the traveler behind, but the other quickened his to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, hoping to lag behind and let the traveler pass. But the other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. On mounting a rising ground that brought the figure in relief against the night sky, Ichabod was horror-struck when he discovered that the rider was indeed headless. But his fears rose even greater still when he realized that the head which should have rested on his shoulders was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. No! He rained a shower of kicks on old Gunpowder, hoping by sudden movement to give the rider the slip, but the spectre started full jump with him. Away they dashed over swamp and stream, stones flying, sparks flashing. Ichabod's flimsy dart fluttered out behind him in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the part of the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, rather than keeping up it, made a lateral move and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow for about a quarter of a mile when it crosses the bridge, famous in goblin tale, and just beyond it stands the whitewashed church. For a moment, the panic of his steed has given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage. But just as they reached halfway through the hollow, Ichabod felt the girths of the saddle start to give way. He endeavored to stand firm by seizing it at the pommel, but it was too late. Just time to save himself by grasping powder around the neck when he felt it fall to the earth and could hear it trampled close behind underfoot. For a moment, the terror of Hunt's on Ripper's wrath passed through his mind. It was no time that he feared the goblin. That he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on the other side, and sometimes vaulted on the high ridge of the horse's back with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. A parting in the church trees now cheered him with the thought that the bridge was close at hand. A silver star in the bosom of the brook told him he was not mistaken. He could see the white walls of the church dimly glaring through the trees. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then he heard the panting and blowing of the horse behind him, and even fancied that he felt its hot breath. He rained another shower of convulsive kicks on old Gunpowder, gained the bridge, thundered over the resounding planks, and gained the opposite side, only now casting a look behind him to see if the riders should disappear according to rule in a flash of fire and brimstone. But Ichabod watched as the goblin horse rose in his stirrups, and in the very act, hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but it was too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash, sending him headlong into the dust. And Gunpowder, the goblin steed, and the rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate, with the bridle under his feet, and without his saddle. Ichabod did not make his appearance that morning at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but there was no Ichabod. The children gathered at the schoolhouse, but they strolled idly along the banks of the brook, for there was no schoolmaster. Hans von Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness as to the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set out, and after diligent search, they soon came upon his traces. A little ways before the bridge was found the saddle, deeply dented and trampled in the dirt, as if it were ridden over at furious pace. And just to the other side of the bridge was found the hat of the unfortunate pedagogue, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the trooper was not to be discovered. Hans von Ripper examined the small bundle which contained all his worldly effects. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, excepting for Cotton Mather's, A History of New England Witchcraft, a book of dreams and fortune-telling, and a book of psalm tunes, in which last was a sheet of foolscap, several times scribbled and blotted over with several fruitless attempts at making a copy of verses in honor of the heiress. These magic texts and the poetic scrawl were henceforth confined to the flame by Hans von Ripper, who determined never again to send his children to school, believing he never knew of any good come from that same reading and writing. The event caused much speculation in the churchyard on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips gathered among the gravestones and where the hat and pumpkin were discovered. The tales of Brower and Bones were called to mind, and after they had compared them with the evidence of the current case, they simply shook their heads and said, Ichabod was carried away by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, no one bothered to say anything more about him. The schoolhouse was moved to a distant part of the hollow, and a new schoolmaster reigned in his stead. It is true that an old farmer some years later returned on a visit from New York, brought home the intelligence that Ichabod was in fact still alive, that he had left the neighborhood partly in fear of the horsemen and partly in mortification at having been dismissed by the heiress, that he had moved his quarters to a distant part of the hollow, that he had kept up school, continued teaching, studied law, been admitted to the bar, became a lawyer, wrote for the newspaper, turned politician, and finally become a justice of the 10-pound court. Brom Bones, too, who shortly after his rivals disappeared, the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, and was always known to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was relayed, and would always burst into a hearty laugh at every mention of the pumpkin, which led some to believe that he knew more than he chose to tell. The church bridge now more than ever became the subject of superstitious beliefs, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late, so as to approach the bridge from the opposite side. The old Dutch wives, however, who are the best judges in matters, affirm to this day that Ichabod was indeed carried away by supernatural means. The old schoolhouse, being abandoned, soon fell into decay and was said to be haunted by the unfortunate pedagogue. And the plowboy, loitering homeward on a still summer evening, can still fancy hearing his voice at a distance, humming a tranquil solitude among the distant, melancholy hills of Sleepy Hollow. I want to thank each and every one of you for braving the cold this evening. Thank you for coming out. To those of you that recognize it, have a blessed Samhain. To the rest of you, a wonderful and safe Halloween. To warm up, I have tea and some apple cider donut cake inside. Please come inside and enjoy some warmth. Thank you again, each and every one of you. Have a safe drive home. Thank you.